morning, everyone. I know you have your scriptures with you. Would you please open them to the Gospel of Mark and the 14th chapter, Mark chapter 14. We're here for a few minutes together in study to prepare our minds and hearts to properly partake of the memorial that Jesus established. And in that way, we couldn't be in a better text. Mark 14 is one of those accounts where Jesus is initiating that supper. That's covered in the four Gospels, and this is one of those cases. So maybe by looking at the initiation of this supper, we can learn some things about it. In this chapter, Jesus is the central figure. Obviously, it is a memorial of his death, and what came after that was his arrest. But there are a couple of other characters that get a lot of attention here in Mark 14. One of them is Judas and his denial and all those things. He will not be our focus today. But the other main character in this last stage of Jesus' life is a man by the name of Peter. Peter was at the supper. Peter didn't just sit in an auditorium and try to remember the day that Jesus established this memorial. He was there at the table when it took place. Look with me in Mark chapter 14 and verse 22. Peter is sitting there with him when Jesus, while they were eating, took some bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Peter was sitting there with Jesus, verse 23, when he had taken the cup and given thanks and gave it to them, and he drank from it. And Jesus said, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." The most concentrated, amazing, life-changing Lord's Supper of all time. And Peter is sitting there at the table looking at Jesus while it happens. What an amazing moment to be a part of. So after that, how does this chapter end? Does it end with Peter so rejuvenated, so transformed, so all in, that he would die for Christ no matter what? Is that the Peter that leaves the table? It is not. One of the things we know most about Mark 14 is about how Jesus said, "You're not ready for what is coming, and you will deny me 3 times. And that's what we get at the end of this beautiful chapter. Look with me in verse 65. Some began to spit at Jesus. They began to blindfold Jesus. They beat him with their fists. They called upon him to prophesy. They slapped him in the face. As Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You were with Jesus the Nazarene." But he denied it, saying, "I neither know nor understand what you're talking about." And he went out into the porch, and a rooster crowed. The servant girl saw him and began once more to say to the bystanders, "This is one of them." But he denied it. And after a little while, the bystanders were again saying, "Surely you're one of them. You're a Galilean too." But he began to curse and swear, "I do not know this man you are talking about." Immediately a rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered how Jesus had made that remark. "Before rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he began to weep. He sits at the table with the Lord, and he walks away from the table, and he denies Jesus when it matters the most. I have an opening question this morning, and maybe a difficult one for you. Do you know what that feels like? Has anybody in this room ever followed that pattern? You show up on Sunday mornings to worship, and you mean it. You're really here to worship. And even before we were setting aside time like this to particularly focus on the table, we always had Lord's Supper talks. We have singings. You know exactly what's going on. You know exactly what he did. And so the tray is passing around. And you're not a hypocrite. You really do think about him, and you contemplate his death, and you partake of the emblems, and you sing the songs, and you believe it. And before the rooster crows in the car ride on the way home, it's as if it never even happened. Monday, when you go about your life and you find yourself in some difficult situation, some time to stand up, some great temptation, it's as if it never even happened, even though you meant it with all your heart. Am I the only person in this room of 300 people who knows what that feels like? That was Peter's experience. What can we learn? we can learn a lot. And what we learn from his experience in the chapter before the denial and what we learn in Acts after it, we can use all of it. We can change things. We can change them on the front end, which is maybe I haven't been partaking exactly how I ought to have been partaking, and then we will see changes on the other end. What I would argue to you is while he denied Jesus 3 times at the end of the chapter, we're going to categorize that as one denial. 3 moments, but one great denial. But it is not his first denial of Jesus. Did you know that Peter denied Jesus long before a servant girl questioned his Galilean heritage? And that's what I want you to see. Peter's first denial came much earlier in the chapter. Peter's first denials came while he was at the table, before he came to the table. Peter's greatest demise here is that there were weaknesses within him, and he refused to face them. The impetus of this study today is this: if we cannot face what's going on inside of us, if we refuse to address denials in our heart, you can partake of this. You can drink every one of those canisters so I don't even get one. You can absolutely dive into this supper and mean it. But if we've already denied Christ in here and here, we will leave this table and what was on the inside will come out. Let me show it to you, and you probably already know. Peter's first denial didn't start afterwards when Jesus was arrested. It started with a very simple quality that the devil has featured that you don't see right away, and you're still going to church, and you're still partaking of the Lord's Supper, and you're still singing praises, but within us is already the seeds of denial, and it is in the form of pride. And it shows up in Peter in a few different ways, but probably the way we know best is after the supper, before things get difficult, Jesus is telling them, you're not ready. You're not ready for this. And Peter's answer is, I'm totally ready for this. Even though all may fall away, yet I will not. It's kind of Peter's story when you go back and look through the Gospels. He was this confident one. He was self-confident, which is a great thing. But here it is turned into pride that he says, I will not fail you. Now the problem with pride is you stop listening. I don't know who it is. I'm not looking around the room. I'll close my eyes if you want me to. But there's someone in this room already this morning not listening. I don't need this. I got this. I'm strong. I stand. Now, if you really went back through last week and you looked at what all those stands looked like after you left church, you might find some weaknesses, but you don't want to look at those. I'm fine. Peter said, I'm fine. When somebody says, I'm fine, you're not fine. One of the things that shows up here is pride. And so what he would have to learn is humility so that he could find the Lord in the right way. Secondly, ignorance. Now, when I say ignorance here, I don't mean stupidity. I don't mean the way we typically talk about somebody being ignorant. What I'm talking about is he believes he can control what is coming. He has no idea what's coming. He has no real concept, but he thinks he does. So pride is, I'm in, and there's nothing the devil can do to knock me out, and then the devil comes in and knocks me out. Number 2 is, I know everything I need to know. I understand everything, and I can control it. And you cannot. Verse 47 illustrates this. There were several cases, but we're just staying in the chapter. In verse 47, verse 45, Judas comes up and kisses Jesus, and the betrayal is taking place. And verse 46, they laid hands on Jesus, they seized Jesus, but one of them who stood by drew his sword, valiantly drew his sword, probably out of fear, and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Now the text doesn't tell you who that is, but John comes in later and just rats Peter out. In John's gospel, he says it was Peter. Peter did it. He's that guy who knows exactly what to do and exactly when to do it and doesn't need to listen and hasn't been really listening for about a year. Because for about a year, Jesus is trying to educate him. Look, here's how this has to go. And it's not the way you think it has to go. And it's completely opposite of the way you would want it to go, but I have to suffer and be beaten and die so that I can be raised. And the first time an opportunity came to submit to that, Peter demonstrates his ignorance, and he strikes Malchus, John tells us, and cuts off his ear. Jesus puts it back on, probably gives Peter one of those stares, you know, those stares, and then on they go. Peter is already staging external denial with internal denial. The third thing along the way is one that we know well from the chapter, a lack of urgency. Now look at the math here. I'm not going to say 1 + 2 = 3, but yeah, that's basically what you're looking at. If I am fine and I will not falter and I know everything I need to know and I'm not really interested in learning, then the result is a lack of urgency. Why do I need to face things? Why is today the day that I need to pour my heart back into Christ? I don't feel like I need to do that. That's denial already. And you know what this looked like? It looked like sleeping, which sometimes happens here, but you know, not always. It looked like sleeping when you need to be awake. It looked like lethargicness when you needed to be astute. It looked like a time of urgency when it wasn't being treated as such. Verse 37 is just one example. Jesus, verse 36, is gone to pray to the Father. Abba, Father, all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, but it's your will I want done. And he came and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, it's interesting he addresses Peter. Remember, he's already said, Peter, you're not ready. You're not ready. You will deny me. And Peter's like, no way I'll do that. I've got it all figured out. Peter, Simon, he says. I like how he calls him Simon. It's sort of like a regression statement. Like, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying that you may not come into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. If this was a self-abasing amen church, we'd let it go right there. The spirit is willing. Your spirit is willing. Do you know that? That's why you're here today. That's why when we're partaking, you're really going to be thinking about all the right things because your spirit is willing, but your flesh is not. Your flesh is weak. Your flesh is temporal and affected by the environment around you, and it's always pushing. And if you're denying him on the inside, it's only a matter of time before your flesh turns that into an external possibility. So here's what's going on. Peter's got some issues. He's not really ready to deal with them. On the heels of those issues, while they're here, they're happening, then comes the passage that we read earlier where Jesus is trying to put the attention on the memorial that's being set up, the covenant that's being set up, the sacrificing of his body, the shedding of his blood, the new covenant, all of these amazing things. And I know that they were amazing, and Peter was right there. But even in that moment, he's struggling. When they met, verse 17, Jesus met with the 12. And in verse 18, as they were reclining at the table and eating, Jesus said, truly I say to you that one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. They began to be grieved and to say to him one by one, surely not I. And he said to them, it is one of the 12 who dips with me in the bowl. What's their attitude? Surely not I. Peter was right there with them in this lack of self-awareness. Now I'll get ahead of ourselves just a little bit as we begin to wrap this up. Do you remember from 1 Corinthians 11 your at least two responsibilities when you partake of this? One is to proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. I believe Peter did that. They all sat there with Jesus and they proclaimed the power of what Jesus was going to do. But what else does it say in 1 Corinthians 11? Each one must do what? I'm going to let you just say that. Examine yourself. You look around and go, what do you mean examine myself? I'm at church. What do you mean examine myself? We're partaking of the Lord's Supper. We're doing the right thing in the right way at the right time with the right people with the right focus. What is there to examine? Well, here's the good news about church. For the most part, when you're in this building, externally things are in really good condition. I mean, look around, right? I mean, this is the stuff right here. This is it. It's Sunday morning. It's a beautiful morning. We're with God's people. This is as good as it's going to get externally. But internally, we've got some evaluation to do, because it was as a result of internal denials, even through the supper, that came the external trial. Denials of Jesus in the face of external trial. And that's what we see in our text when we get to the end, but it's not a surprise. And I would tell you it's not a surprise in your life either. Go with me to Luke's account. Luke chapter 22, a couple of thoughts here. Luke 22. You guys remember what happened? You guys remember what happened when Peter denied Jesus for the third time? He felt very far from Jesus. I think there's a sense in which, because of the pride and the lack of understanding and the lack of preparation, when things got difficult externally, he felt very distanced from Jesus. He's been detained. He's in this area, and Peter's outside in the courtyard, and you kind of feel like you're far away from Jesus. And because he wasn't ready, he falters. But does anybody remember what happened when he denied Jesus the third time? Luke chapter 22 and verse 61. The Lord turned and looked at Peter. Can you visualize that for just a minute? I will never deny you. I've got total control. I don't need to prepare. I'm with you. Denial, denial, denial. And Jesus just looks at him. How many of you know what that feels like? I see Jesus in my mind's eye. I see his gaze. I see it when he smiles, when he's happy, when he's thankful. And I felt this gaze as well. And Peter responded as you do. He fled in sorrow. What a disappointment. Now, Judas gave up. Peter didn't. But how does our story end? It doesn't end there. What I'm setting up for you is a reality for some of the people in the room. We may as well face it. You know, we could come in here and talk about how this is just great and everything's great and the week goes great and there's this perfect continuity between worship and Mondays. And there are people here who experience that. But it felt important to me to address those who don't feel that, who know this story right here really, really well and have come all the way to this point and know exactly what a Tuesday afternoon feels like when Sunday feels like it's 100 miles away. I'll tell you this, everything changed after that. And that's what I'm inviting you to. I'm inviting you to a place where we don't continue a cycle that none of us wants. That we don't continue to get to work or school or about our business, and it's time to stand up for Christ, and it's time to do what's right, and we just fall again. And we start wondering, does Sundays even matter? Does this even matter when every Wednesday I fall apart? It does matter, but you've got to examine yourself. And maybe it starts with the three things at the top. 1 Corinthians 11, each person must examine himself. Are you ready to be humble? I have failed Jesus. I can fail Jesus. I don't want to fail Jesus. Jesus, will you help me? Holy Spirit, will you strengthen me? God, will you guide me? I am ignorant. Yes, I can quote a bunch of Bible verses. But I do not know what your plans are, and I do not know all things, and I'm tired of kind of pretending that I do. And I'm ready to say that I can't control what is and what will be, and I need to resign that control over to you. This all happens here, you guys. Happens here. You haven't even experienced anything yet this week. It happens here. And number 3, this is urgent. This cycle that I think can just keep going and one day it'll just sort of work itself out. Things are getting pretty urgent. And I'm ready to stay awake. And I'm ready to focus on you. And if that's the way we use the Lord's Supper, what happens if you take humility, a search for wisdom, and urgency. What happens if you take that into this? Things happen. And they happen differently than maybe they've ever happened before. So I'm going to leave this slide up, and I don't want you to go, all right, I think Kris is saying I should take pride, ignorance, and lethargicness into the supper. No, we know what happens. That's Peter's story. Maybe it's your story. We don't want that story. So this time we take humility, seeking for knowledge, and a real sense of urgency. Peter changed his life. Go to Acts 2 as we close. Acts 2. Peter partook of the Lord's Supper again later. In fact, he did so probably many, many times, every first day of the week during the years that he was allowed to live once the church was established. And in verse 38, Peter preaches this great sermon and repent and be baptized, and 3,000 people are baptized. And then it talks about how they were continually devoting themselves, verse 42, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. But things were different for him now. Now he partook like we're about to partake, but his heart was right. His attitude was changed. His perspective was broadened. And so now when he comes out of these suppers and you start flipping your pages to the right, you don't see denials. You don't see that anymore. You don't see Jesus looking at him and him feeling crushed. You see things like chapter 4. You start to see things like chapter 4 in verse 12, where he stands in front of the Sadducees and the priests, and he says, there is salvation in no one else. For there is no other name under heaven that has been given among men by which we might be saved. And they said, stop preaching. They said, stop speaking of these things. And he says, look, verse 19, whatever you need to do, you do it. But we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard. That's a very different Peter. That is who I want to be. I want to be that guy. Things changed. Two things changed. I'm closing up. Two things changed. How many of you know God always goes first? If he wants you to change, he'll do something first. What's the difference between the supper in Mark 14 and the imminent denial, and the supper of Acts 2 and the great courageous stand? Well, you go, well, Peter was, no, not, what was the change that was bigger than Peter? Jesus was raised from the dead. The resurrection changed the supper. You guys follow me? The resurrection changed the supper. It's not just a memorial of somebody who died for us. It is the beginning of a triumphant story of everlasting life. Peter first saw God make the change through the resurrection. And then Peter followed suit and changed his own life in the three ways you see at the top. I got news for you. I don't know if you are humbled and thirsty for knowledge and ready to repent, or if you think it's your turn to go, or is it God's turn to go, or who goes first. Here's the news. Jesus has been raised from the dead. God went first. He changed the game. He changed everything. The only thing left to do is for you to change you. Here. When we acknowledge him here, we acknowledge him here. The continuity is beautiful and divine. Think about that as you think about what he did first and what it means to honor it and the choices that we make.